If you've been sewing your buttons on by hand, let me blow your mind and show you how quickly and easily you can do it by machine. First things first, we are going to lower the feed dogs on the machine. That's going to make sure that when we stitch, the fabric doesn't move front to back. We'll turn it on here, and then we want to select a zigzag stitch. That's going to be stitch number 5 for me here on my Rachel. Now, to determine the width of the stitch, you do need to measure the button that you are sewing. So when you look at your button, you'll find that you've got eyes. You may have 2 or 4, and you can do either style button this way, but you want to measure the distance between the centers of those eyes. So I like to use a little seam gauge. I can lay it right on there and see just how many millimeters exist between those 2 eyes, and I think I'm about 4 millimeters. And it's important to measure this carefully because you don't want your needle to drop down into your button. So I'm going to set my stitch width to that 4 millimeter width. And now I've got a really cool foot to use for this. This is the button sew-on foot that comes with my machine. And what I love about this is it almost has like a little mouth here. I can slide my button right in there. It holds it in place, and I want to center the button so that the eyes are right between the red dots on the edges of the foot. Now, my button has a little bit of a scoop to it, so there's automatically some distance between the needle threads and the button itself. But if you have a real flat button and you want to make sure you've got a little bit of movement to your button once it's stitched on, there's a little lever here you can push forward, and it puts a plastic like spacer essentially between the button and the threads, and that's going to make sure that your button has a little bit of flexibility, because if it's completely flat to your fabric, it's hard to get it into a buttonhole. So you could stitch it with or without that. And now I'm going to attach the button sew-on foot to my machine. Now, if you can't lower the feed dogs on your machine, you can adjust your stitch length to 0, and that way it'll just stitch right over top of itself. I've got my foot attached so I can slide my fabric right under, and you want to just position it right where you want the button to stitch. And before you begin stitching with your foot pedal, it's a good idea just to turn the hand wheel toward you, just to watch that needle drop down into each of the eyes of your button and make sure your needle's not going to hit the button. I'm safe, so now I'm ready to stitch. Once your needle has dropped down into each of the eyes, say 8 or 10 times, you should have a pretty secure button. Now we're ready to lift the needle, and then we're going to lift the presser foot, and you want to just very carefully push down on your button to release it from the foot, and then pull it off from the machine. Now you're going to use a hand sewing needle or whatever tool you've got to bring your top thread down to the bottom and tie a little knot in it to secure the button. The very best way to make sure that your button is not going to fall off, you're going to take your hand needle with your threads in it, go right into one of the eyes of your button, but we're not going all the way through the fabric yet. We are just shooting that needle right between the fabric and the button itself. Pull it out, and then you want to just wrap your threads around the threads that are in kind of like the shank of the button. So that's the area between the button itself and the fabric. Once you've wrapped around a few times, pull it nice and tight, and then you're going to take your needle and go back through to the bottom side of your fabric. So just like this. And then you can tie the beginning threads. So these are the threads from when I started my button, with the ending threads that are still in my needle. Make sure you tie a nice tight square knot. Then you're going to trim everything off, and you should have a very secure button. There we go. And again, just give it a nice snip, and you have a fantastic button. Your machine may come with a sew-on button stitch already built in, and what you would be looking for in your machine is just a circle with 2 dots, looks just like a button. That's your sew-on button stitch, and it just stitches side to side automatically, and then you don't have to lower the feed dogs or adjust the stitch length and width. It just does it all on its own. So be sure to check out the stitches built into your machine and the owner's manual to see what they're used for. You can always ask your local retailer too. Thanks so much for watching.